Scenario planning has a very interesting history. It dates back to the early 1970s, where it originated at Shell, the oil company. Shell at the time had difficulty predicting its cash flows. It would go from a period of abundance of cash to periods of shortages of cash. Now, obviously, that was not a way of running a business back then as it is today, so they wanted to find a way to more accurately predict their cash flows. Now, they had several consultants look into this problem, and all of these consultants failed. They didn't come up with a good solution to the problem. So at some point they turned to a guy called Pierre Wack. Pierre Wack was a Frenchman. He was the head of group planning at Shell, and Pierre Wack said, I'm going to do this differently. And Pierre Wack started to look around, and he noticed there were two big possible game changers at the horizon. The first one was that America at the time was transitioning from an oil exporting nation to an oil importing nation. If you were looking at the lines of supply and demand, you could see that within a matter of years, America was no longer going to be self-sufficient in its oil needs, and it was going to start to rely on other countries for its oil. And he wondered, what's that going to mean? Is it going to be a big change, a small change? He didn't know. The second thing he noticed is that with some frequency, several countries were coming together to align their communication strategy, and nobody thought much of them. There were countries like Venezuela, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. At that point in time, they were considered a tiger without teeth. But Pierre Wack wondered, well, what if they do muscle up and become a force in our oil industry? Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that was the beginning of the OPEC, but at that point in time, nobody could predict that. With those two big uncertainties at the horizon, Pierre Wack started to develop a number of scenarios. If this would happen, if that would happen, if this would happen, if that would happen. That way, he arrived at four very distinctive outlooks on the future. One of the outlooks he developed was a scarily accurate prediction of the oil crisis that happened 3 years later. It was called at that point the crisis scenario. And in that scenario, Pierre Wack tried to understand the logic, how could we eventually arrive in this scenario. Now, the fact that he had it right is not the crux of this story. What's really important is that once Pierre Wack had his different scenarios worked out, he brought the senior leadership of Shell together, locked them into a room, and for 2 days they worked themselves through these various outlooks, and for each of these scenarios he asked them, if this were to happen, what would we do? So when the oil crisis actually did happen, as it was the case in one of the scenarios he had developed, Shell was mentally ready to take a couple of very decisive actions where their competitors needed years to realize they had entered a new reality. Shell moved from the 7th position in the world to the 2nd position in the world in the 2 years following the oil crisis. And a large part of that has been attributed to the work of Pierre Wack with senior leadership on the future. The importance of scenario planning, in my view, is that it very constructively works with our uncertainties. Rather than focusing on the things that we know about the future, scenario planning puts your uncertainty at the heart of its thinking and works constructively with the key uncertainties that you face as you are looking forward into the future. A very powerful method, still used today, originated in the 70s, and something to think about when you do your future planning.